Have you ever wondered what it actually smelled like inside a frontier saloon in the summer of 1880? Not the whiskey, not the tobacco smoke. Something underneath both of those. The sawdust on the floor had been there since Monday. The spittoons had been emptied once, maybe. The man standing next to you had not bathed since the cattle drive ended 2 weeks ago. And the man next to him had not bathed since the one before that. Now add 200 people into a room the size of a large barn, every window sealed against the dust outside, and understand that the glass being handed to you across the bar has already been to 100 other mouths today. And the bartender ran a rag across it before he handed it to you. That rag is what this story is actually about. Here is what the Hollywood version got completely wrong about the Frontier Saloon. It got the violence wrong, the glamour wrong, and the whiskey wrong. But the thing it got most wrong was the one thing it never mentioned at all, which was the biology. A frontier saloon in the 1880s was not just a dangerous place because of the men with guns. It was a dangerous place because of the men with lungs. This is what was actually happening inside those buildings. Documented, specific, and considerably worse than anything you have seen in any Western film. To understand the saloon in the 1880s, you need to understand what it actually was. The Frontier Saloon was not primarily a drinking establishment. It was the only social infrastructure in most frontier towns. The post office, the bank lobby, the hotel lobby, the courthouse waiting room, all in one sawdust-floored space. In 1876, Dodge City issued liquor licenses to 19 establishments serving a permanent population of roughly 1,200 people. One licensed drinking house for every 61 residents. During cattle season, the actual number of bodies moving through those buildings on any given night was far higher. The detail that reframes everything is this: the vast majority of those men were not ordering drinks. They were standing inside the only building with a roof and other human beings in it after months of sleeping on open ground. That is the context in which one glass, one rag, and 200 mouths becomes a public health event rather than a question of manners. Now put yourself behind the bar. A Dodge City bartender in the summer of 1880 operated under one fundamental constraint: glassware. There was not enough of it. The standard practice was to collect a returned glass, drag a rag across the inside to remove the worst of the residue, fill it again, and send it back. Some establishments had a rinse bucket behind the bar. The water in that bucket was changed on a busy night, perhaps once. After that, it was a dilution of whatever had already been in it: whiskey, backwash, tobacco residue, and whatever was living in the mouths of the 200 people who had passed through since sundown. The rag itself deserves its own moment of consideration. At the start of a Saturday night in an 1880 Dodge City saloon, the bar rag was white, or close to it. By the time the last man was served, it was the color of the floor. A bartender who had been working for 4 hours had used that rag on every surface behind the bar: the wood, the glass, his own hands, and then the glass again. The rag was not rinsed between uses. There was no system for doing so, and no awareness that one was needed. Germ theory had arrived in European science, but not yet in the consciousness of a Kansas barkeep who was managing 100 customers at once and had never been told that a piece of wet cloth could transmit disease. Nobody had told him that. Not yet. That is a critical phrase because the timeline here is where the real story lives. On March 24, 1882, Robert Koch announced before the Berlin Physiological Society that he had isolated the organism responsible for tuberculosis. Mycobacterium tuberculosis, transmitted through the air, through respiratory droplets, through shared surfaces in enclosed spaces. It was the most consequential medical announcement of the 19th century. Coke had just handed the world the means to understand a disease that was killing, by the best available accounting, something close to 1 in every 7 or 8 people on the continent. Between 70 and 90% of urban populations in North America had already been exposed. Of those who developed active tuberculosis, 8 in 10 died of it. Here is the part that matters for a man standing in a Dodge City saloon. The frontier was not ignoring Coke because it did not care. It was ignoring Coke because there was no mechanism for caring. There was no public health infrastructure on the Kansas frontier in 1882. No medical journal subscription behind the bar. No system by which a scientific announcement in Berlin could reach a bartender in Ford County, Kansas, by the following Monday, or the following year, or the following decade. The first anti-spitting ordinance in the United States was passed in New York City in 1896. That is 14 years after Koch named the organism, described its transmission, and published the paper that should have changed everything. On the frontier, the same glass, the same rag, the same closed room. Not because nobody knew, because the information had not arrived, and there was no road for it to travel. Think about what those 14 years contain. Now think about Dodge City in the summer of 1878. Bat Masterson was 24 years old. He was the sitting sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, and was spending part of that summer following the gambling circuit through the saloons of the frontier, playing faro, the most popular card game in the West, at tables across Dodge. He had seen the Lady Gay saloon on the south side of the tracks, and the Long Branch on the north, and he understood the social mechanics of those rooms the way any man understands the people he shares a space with for months at a time. What Bat Masterson did not know in the summer of 1878, what no one in that saloon knew, was what was moving through the room with them. A man named Doc Holliday was dealing faro at that table, with a tuberculosis diagnosis he had carried for years. Consider the arithmetic of that room. Dodge City in the summer of 1878. A crowded saloon. Documented exposure rates for tuberculosis in North American frontier populations running between 40 and 70% by the estimates that exist. Active tuberculosis incubating silently in a significant portion of those exposed, contagious well before symptoms became visible. A room of 150 men sealed against the dust, air moving nowhere. The probability that at least one person in that room had active, contagious tuberculosis was not a guess. It was a near certainty. The uncertainty was only about which person it was. You could not tell by looking. Nobody could. You are at that table. It is July 1878. The Long Branch is full. The air sits thick with smoke and body heat. A glass comes to you from the bar, wiped clean with the rag, passed from the bartender's hand to yours. The glass is still warm from the hands of the man who had it before you. You have no way to know which man that was. Somewhere in this room, someone is coughing. You can hear it. You cannot know what it means. Nobody in this room has been given the information that would tell them. Nobody in that room does. The men at those tables had no way to know what the glass between them contained. That was not ignorance born of laziness. It was the specific ignorance of a world that had not yet been handed the information that would have changed its behavior. And the frontier was the last place that information arrived. Some historians argue the frontier saloon was no more dangerous than the streets outside it. That men were dying of the same things everywhere, not specifically because of the glass they shared. I'm not sure I accept that framing. Tell me if you do. The whiskey itself was often not whiskey. In smaller frontier establishments, the bottles behind the bar were regularly refilled from bulk barrels of a product whose ingredients historians have documented in detail. The standard adulterants were turpentine for color and burn, cayenne for heat, tobacco for bitterness, and occasionally strychnine in small doses because strychnine in small doses produces a sharp physical sensation. Muscle tension, a sudden stiffening through the jaw and neck, that drinkers associated with the kick of a strong spirit. One documented combination from the Canadian frontier whiskey trade went by the name 40 Rod, so called because it was supposed to kill a man at 40 rods distance. Its recipe included raw grain alcohol, tobacco oil, and red pepper. In a mining camp saloon in the Colorado Rockies in 1880, or in a cattle town at the end of a drive season when the good whiskey had already run out, what came out of the bottle was not always classifiable as a food product. The strychnine did not kill in small doses. It made the product feel more potent, which encouraged men to drink more of it. It is tempting to look at this and feel nothing but contempt. The shared glass, the adulterated whiskey, the consumptive gambler coughing across a card table, the rag that started white and ended brown. Stop there, because what is also true is that those saloons were the only community these men had. After 3 months on a cattle drive, sleeping on open ground, eating salt pork and dried beans, riding through weather that killed livestock and occasionally riders, the frontier saloon was the first human warmth a cowboy had access to. It was not luxury. It was not romance. It was a lamp burning in a dark town, and the men who walked through the door were not walking toward entertainment. They were walking toward other human beings. The bartenders who ran those establishments worked 16-hour days, managed violent men with professional calm, and maintained the only functioning social order in towns that had no other institution to provide it. The men who drank there were operating with the same information every institution in the country operated with at the same time. When the information changed, behavior changed too. Not fast enough. But it changed. The frontier was a place of radical isolation, and these men found each other in the worst possible conditions and built something that held together long enough to matter. We should not look at that with disgust. We should look at it with something considerably closer to awe. One last image. Somewhere in the Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City in the summer of 1878, a glass moves from hand to hand across a card table. It has been wiped. It holds whiskey. It is passed to a man who has never seen the person it came from. The man takes a drink. He sets the glass down. The game continues. He does not know what the glass has carried. No one in that room does. The information that would change that is still 4 years away, crossing an ocean at the speed of a scientific paper that has not yet been written. The glass moved. The night moved. The West moved.